Okay, today I'm going to talk a little about this substance called myostatin, which holds a lot of fascination with people involved in weight training and anyone who wants to develop muscle. For those of you who don't know what myostatin is, you can kind of tell what it is by the name myostatin. The prefix myo, M-Y-O, that stands for muscle. Statin stands for stop. So if you put the two words together, you have stop muscle, which accurately describes what myostatin actually does. It inhibits muscle growth. Myostatin was discovered in 1997 by geneticists at Johns Hopkins University. Uh, what happened is they were looking for genes and they found this gene which they named myostatin, and then they kind of produced a type of a special type of mouse where they were able to delete. They call it a knockout. They were able to delete the two genes for myostatin, so they produced a mouse that was born lacking the genes for myostatin. This particular mouse had twice the muscle size of other mice, and it was dubbed Mighty Mouse, right? Okay, it turns out that they later on found out that there were natural instances of myostatin in the animal world, particularly, for example, cattle. They've discovered there was two types of cattle. One was called Piedmontese, the other one's called Belgian Blue. And some of these cattle were naturally born without the genes for myostatin, which made them not only huge, but just rippling in muscle with no apparent fat on their body. They were literally kind of like the cattle version of Mr. Olympia. Now, in the case of the Belgian Blue cattle, what happened was the lack of myostatin genes caused the cattle, even before they were born, their muscles underwent a process called hyperplasia, muscle splitting, where they produce an unusually large number large number of muscle fibers even before they were born, and the preponderance of muscle fibers they did have was what they call type 2B, which are also called fast twitch fibers, which happen to be the muscle fibers that are most amenable to muscle growth. So these cattle were basically born with massive muscles, you know. Now it turns out, however, that they also unfortunately show they're very prone to stress. They also show increased muscle damage following exercise. They have respiratory or breathing problems. They tend to have heart problems, which I'll get into a little later, related to myostatin. And they also show a lower level of what they call VO2 max, which is maximal oxygen uptake. It's a measure of endurance. And they also discovered there was a type of breed of dogs called Whippets, which kind of look a little like greyhounds. I guess they're related to greyhounds. I'm not sure about that, but they look like Whippets, and a couple of them were born also without the genes of myostatin. And these Whippets most Whippets, I mean, if you know what a greyhound looks like, it's kind of a slim dog. These Whippets that were born without genes for myostatin were like massive. They were also rippling in muscle, very rippling. And the interesting thing was they called them bully dogs because they were so much bigger than the other Whippets. But what's kind of weird is that they were actually more gentle and sweet than the normal Whippets, even though they were like 3 times bigger as far as the muscle size. Now, an interesting thing with the Whippet dogs that were born with a complete lack of myostatin genes, which means 2 genes were missing, they were not only much more muscular than other Whippets, but they were faster. Because, these Whippets are like greyhounds. They tend to be fast dogs when they run. However, the Whippets that lacked only one gene, they call that homozygous. When they lack one gene for myostatin, were kind of muscular, but they weren't faster than the other Whippets. So, the full expression of lack of myostatin in the dogs obviously caused them to have a greater amount of fast twitch muscle fibers. And fast twitch muscle fibers are what gives muscle speed. That's what gives you speed, which is kind of relates to the old myth about how having muscles makes you slow. Well, the thing that makes you fast is having fast twitch muscles, And fast twitch muscles are the muscles that grow. Speed has to do with how you train, and there's other factors I'm not going to get into now. That's a whole different subject. But as far as humans go, it was kind of speculative until 2004, when there was an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it related to a 4.5-year-old German boy who they discovered was born without genes for myostatin. And this kid, even as an infant, was unusually muscular. And by the age of 4.5, he was much stronger than kids his age. And further testing showed that his mother used to be a champion sprinter. She herself was born with a lack of one gene for myostatin, but the baby, her son, lacked 2 genes. Now, they haven't followed up on this kid, so I couldn't tell you how he is now. This was a couple of years ago. I don't know what he looks like now. I don't know what's going on there. But I do know that his family, this might have been some sort of genetic inheritance thing, because the men in his family were known for being unusually big and strong and muscular. So this might have gone back a ways in his family as far as that goes. But, now you think about it, okay, myostatin, it stops muscle growth. I mean, that's a natural for the food supplement industry. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And sure enough, not long after myostatin was discovered in 1997, the food supplement companies immediately scrambled to try and come up with a natural substance. They couldn't produce a drug because they'd have to go through FDA approval. So they kind of came up, they searched for a substance that might inhibit myostatin, which they could sell as a so-called myostatin blocker. Anyway, they discovered in a very obscure Bulgarian medical journal that probably read by about 10 people, but anyway, this Bulgarian medical journal discussed how a type of seaweed, if you kind of isolate a myostatin protein, and you put it in a test tube exposed to the seaweed will bind to the myostatin and basically blunt its effects or inhibit its effects, right? All right, so one company in particular got a hold of this research, and they went on in their website. They announced that they were going to produce this myostatin blocker made from the seaweed. And it was going to produce all kinds of massive muscles, and it was going to their ad copy talked about how it would allow you to develop muscle size past your genetic limit, because the brakes on muscle size would be gone. In other words, if you block myostatin, there's nothing to prevent you from getting bigger and bigger. That's what they claimed, right? Well, I remember reading their article where they even did a preemptive strike. They talked about how they had kind of like cornered the world market supply of this seaweed, and it was so effective that anyone who criticized it was simply jealous because they had the exclusive right to produce this supplement. Unfortunately, it took about maybe 2-3 years after that, they actually came around to testing this particular supplement in human subjects. It turns out they were a group of bodybuilders, and they gave them this supplement, this seaweed supplement, touted to boost myostatin. And what they found was that the supplement produced no change in body composition, no increased muscle size, no lowering of myostatin in the blood. It did absolutely nothing. So the seaweed basically worked in vitro or in a test tube. It did not work in the human body. The site that bragged about how big it was going to make you quietly withdrew it, and it was never mentioned again. So, but it didn't end there. I mean, it's just too good to kind of let go. So more recently, a company came out with another myostatin blocker, which still exists now. I believe this stuff cost $100 a month, and it's based on a protein called follistatin. Follistatin is made in the human body, and sure enough, when it kind of like locks onto myostatin, and it prevents myostatin from basically expressing itself. In other words, it blocks myostatin from working. in the body, right? In fact, that's one of the things they're investigating now. Scientists are looking to develop follistatin as a treatment to basically block myostatin as a treatment for various muscle diseases, which I'll get into later, sarcopenia, which is loss of muscle with age, and so on and so forth. So they're selling this follistatin supplement. The follistatin is derived from eggs, and they're making all the same claims. They sponsored a study done down in Florida where they supposedly had a group of bodybuilders use the supplement, and the bodybuilders made all these gains on the supplement, which just proves one thing. It showed, which I've written in my articles many times, if you want to, you could design a study to show any kind of results that you want, because the truth of the matter is follistatin is a protein, and when you take it orally, it's digested in the gut like any other protein, and it's broken down, and it's not going to do anything to follistatin if you take it in pill form. It's a complete, utter waste of money, right? Now, the thing is, you might be wondering, what about the follistatin they use in research? That's injected follistatin. Whole different ball game there, right? Okay, now another thing to consider here is that, while there's little doubt that blocking myostatin would promote muscular growth in young and old animals, including humans, the actual ergogenic potential is questionable for a number of reasons. For one, animal studies have shown reduced capillation. That capillaries are the small blood vessels, the smallest blood vessels. These are the things that actually feed your muscle fibers. They deliver oxygen and nutrients in the muscle fibers. And in the animal studies, the animals that lack myostatin or are given drugs that blunt or block myostatin, they show reduced capitalization in muscles, which means the blood delivery to the muscles is decreased. What this will result in is usually decreased endurance and increased muscle fatigue when you exercise, although that honestly hasn't really been tested in humans. It's basically hypothetical at this point. Okay, now they did show up in the cattle, though. The cattle that were born lacking the myostatin genes, they did show unusual fatigue, so it probably does show up. Other animal studies show that the lack of myostatin reduces force production in muscle, which means less muscle strain. So you get, if you were to block myostatin, you'd get a larger muscle. Your muscles would grow, but it would not be accompanied with increased strength. So you'd get like a big muscle, but a muscle that's not really strong, as strong as its proportional size. In fact, what's interesting about this is also happens with growth hormone. When growth hormone increases muscle size, you get a bigger muscle, but you don't get a stronger muscle. And by the way, growth hormone itself inhibits myostatin. Another interesting thing, and you might have, people, if you go on the web, you'll see a couple of articles about this, is a couple of elite bodybuilders have been rumored to have mutations in their myostatin genes, which would account for their responsiveness in both exercise and anabolic drugs. In other words, if you're lacking myostatin genes, or even if you're lacking just one gene, homozygous, if you're lacking just one gene for myostatin, and you work out, you lift weights, and you take anabolic drugs, you're going to be extremely responsive. You're going to get like blow up. You're going to get huge, right? So, if you think about it, if you look at the pro bodybuilder today, you kind of have to say, well, gee, that makes sense. Maybe these guys really are, maybe, they probably are just lacking one gene. And the reason I say that is because if they were born without both genes, they'd be like the Belgian cattle. In other words, they would have been muscular all their lives. From the time they were babies, these guys would be walking around with unusual musculature and almost no body fat. And from what I know about most of the bodybuilders, I don't know a lot of these guys personally, but back in the day when I used to go to a lot of contests, I knew a lot of the pro bodybuilders. Most of the bodybuilders that I knew started out skinny. They were what they call ectomorphs. They built up their muscles through exercise, drugs, or whatever, but they were not naturally muscular to begin with, which means that none of these guys were born without myostatin. So now the guys, there could have been a couple of them that had one gene, that was born without one gene for myostatin. Those would be the guys, when they did start working out, even before they took steroids, they were very responsive. They grew very fast. They were what they call the fast gainers that you might have heard about. One bodybuilder who claims to he's publicly said that he has a myostatin deletion, which is meaning he's lacking one gene for myostatin, is Kenneth Flex Wheeler. Flex Wheeler is an old friend of mine. He's a great guy. And I could tell you that I think most people agree with me. He is one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders in the history of bodybuilding. This guy had an incredible physique. He was, very tiny joints. I mean, I can go on and on. You can look at pictures of him if you don't know who he is. This guy probably should have been Mr. Olympia a couple of times. But Ken or Flex will be the first to tell you, and you can look at photos of this too. Before he started lifting weights, the guy was like bone thin. I mean, this guy was like a skeleton. So it makes me doubt that he has any kind of gene deletion from myostatin, because even having one gene, he should have had a little bit more muscle on him. The photos I saw a very skinny kid. I mean, of course, when he did work out, sure enough, he did respond very fast. So again, it's a possibility that he had this gene. But you see, the thing is that Flex got this idea because he was one of the subjects of a medical journal article. The journal was called Genomics. In an article published in 1999, they basically looked at a bunch of humans that might have had myostatin deletions, including Flex Wheeler, and they wanted to see if there was any relationship between the size of these guys' muscles and any possible relationship to a lack of myostatin. And the study concluded that there was no relationship. They could find no relationship between any myostatin gene deletion and the size of these guys' muscles. So the point is, Flex Wheeler may or may not have this myostatin deletion. Another guy who's rumored, a current pro bodybuilder, who's rumored to have the myostatin deletion is this guy who they call, I don't know his real name, you'll have to excuse me, this guy they call Big Ramey. This guy is, again, immense. He's gigantic. I never met the man. I've never seen him in person. But just going by pictures, this guy is absolutely huge. I would almost believe, actually, that this guy either lacks one gene for myostatin or possibly even two genes, except for one thing. I've never seen photos of what he looked like before he began training, and that would be the acid test. Because if this guy had muscles all his life, since he was a child, even before he lifted weights, that would be indicative of being born without two genes of myostatin. If he was kind of on the muscular side but not really huge, then that would kind of like be indicative of having one gene deletion for myostatin. So I think we could possibly give him the benefit of the doubt and say he possibly could have a single gene deletion for myostatin. I'm talking about Big Ramey here. So, remember, having lacking one gene will make you, again, a fast gainer. These would be the people, you've seen them, we've all seen them, anyone who goes to gyms, they show up, they've never lifted a weight. Within about 3 months, they look like they can compete in a bodybuilding contest. And it used to be attributed to having high testosterone level. It's not. It's not the testosterone level. It's usually lacking a gene in myostatin. There's a lot of people walking around that probably have this gene deletion, don't even know it, but they tend to be. They probably will tell you they've been kind of they call themselves athletic looking or muscular most of their lives, and this is the reason why. The only way they would be able to know is if they had a genetic test for myostatin genes, right? Okay, so also I should also mention that some of these guys that lack the gene for myostatin, when they do work out, they're going to be hyper responsive to working out, diet, and even if they don't use drugs, they're going to still look very muscular. And I suspect that a lot of these guys that call themselves drug free, that are ridiculed because they're called liars, because people look at their photos and they have these, they have vascularity, they have highly defined muscles. They're accused of taking drugs, but it could, again, this is strictly speculative, what I'm saying here. It could be that these guys, not lacking two genes, but they could be lacking one gene for myostatin. It would give them a hyper muscular physique when they worked out. They still have to work out, but when they did work out, it would be like the proverbial fish to water type of thing. They would just be tremendously responsive. Another interesting thing about myostatin, excuse me, another interesting thing about myostatin is besides promoting muscle growth, animals that lack myostatin show pronounced lower body fat levels. I mean, this is like the holy grail. Think about it. Large muscles and low body fat. I mean, this is what everyone in bodybuilding is after, basically. Mice lacking genes for myostatin show an average of 40% less body fat than normal mice. One reason for this is that, and they discovered this fairly recently, is that myostatin promotes you see, most fat in your body is what they call white fat. I don't want to go into the pharmacology or the physiology of fat. That's a whole different subject. I'm going to be talking about that in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, because there's a lot of fascinating things about body fat that people aren't aware of. But that's for my newsletter. But I will tell you this, that there's another type of fat called brown adipose tissue. They call it BAT for short. They used to think that this tissue was only existed in babies and infants, usually kind of in the upper back around the neck. More recently, they discovered that it also shows up in adult humans, right? Now, how do you know you have a preponderance or a larger amount of brown adipose tissue? We've all seen these kind of people. You ever see these kind of people where they seem like they can eat anything? I mean, they can eat pizza, ice cream, all kinds of junk, and yet they don't get fat. Well, these are the people that have active brown adipose tissue. What's happening is all those excess calories they're eating is being converted into heat, because what brown adipose tissue is what they call thermogenic tissue. It basically converts calories into heat. It's that the calories are dissipated as heat, so they don't convert into body fat. Very interesting, right? Now get this. It turns out that the mice lacking myostatin, when you lack myostatin, your body tends to convert your white fat into, guess what? Brown adipose tissue, or more specifically, what they call beige tissue, which is kind of a type of fat that's in between regular fat and in between brown adipose tissue, but it still tends to be thermogenic, meaning it still tends to dissipate calories as heat. And this accounts for the fact that the rats, or the mice, I should say, that were completely lacking myostatin had 40% less body fat. Okay, that's the good part. Let's talk about a bad part thing now here. It turns out that blocking this is something that I looked at a couple of videos on myostatin before I did this one, and I wanted to see what they said, and most of them were rah-rah videos. They were talking about how great myostatin is, how it'll give you all this muscle mass and blah, blah, blah. But they didn't tell you some of the things I'm about to tell you now, and that's one of the main purposes of this video. For one thing, it turns out that myostatin is needed for the maintenance and repair of tendons. Now, we all know what happens when you tear, or when you kind of like rip a tendon or cause an injury to a tendon, or get an inflammation in a tendon, which is called tendinitis. It kind of screws up your training. It's a lot of pain involved, right? Well, it turns out that without myostatin, the animals that are lacking myostatin have brittle, weak tendons. I'm talking about a complete lack of myostatin, the ones that are born without the genes for myostatin. So, what happens is that, think about it. I mean, if you took a supplement or a drug, theoretically, that was able to lower myostatin, or it's just about gone, and you went to the gym and you worked out, your muscles would grow like crazy, but your tendons would not be repairing themselves, and you'd be getting one injury after another, to the point where eventually you probably wouldn't even be able to work out. So that's something to consider, right? Another thing that more recent studies show. Let me backtrack. When myostatin was first discovered, the scientists were a little concerned because they realized that myostatin causes pronounced growth of skeletal muscle. But skeletal muscle is not the only muscle in your body. Your heart is a muscle. It's a different type of muscle. And the concern of the scientists was, now, if lack of myostatin, I should say, stimulated this pronounced growth of skeletal muscles, what is it going to do to the heart? Well, we got our hint in some of those cattle I spoke about earlier. they have a tendency to heart problems, right? The Whippet dogs that were born without myostatin, they have a tendency to heart problems. But until recently, they weren't sure why myostatin could adversely affect the heart. But a recent study showed exactly what can happen. And again, this was an animal study, but what it found was that myostatin regulates energy balance in the heart. Having a normal production of myostatin prevents heart failure. So now think about that for a second. If you take something, a drug, a supplement that does block myostatin, which by the way doesn't exist, I just want to make that clear. There's no supplement right now that actually blocks myostatin. There are some drugs, I'll tell you about them in a minute. But if you were to take any things and really block myostatin, you would eventually get heart failure. So that's something to think about, right? And now, is there a way around this where you can get big muscles without adversely affecting the heart? Yes, there is. I'm going to tell you about that too. That's coming up in the future. There is a way of doing that, right? Okay, so let's uh, uh, let's talk about ways that you can boost myostatin. The first way involves no drugs, no nothing, right? Okay, it turns out that every time you lift weights, you lower myostatin, believe it or not. You actually lower myostatin. And depending on which study you look at, the percentage of myostatin is anywhere from 30 to 44%. Every time you lift weights, you lower your myostatin levels by 44%, which is about the same as what that supplement was claiming. The supplement I said earlier, where they kind of commissioned a study of bodybuilders to show that it works. Well, guess what? These bodybuilders also lifted weights during the study, and they coincidentally had about a 40% lower level of myostatin, which they attributed to the supplement. You see the connection there? You see how they manipulate all the lies and the crap that they lay on people? But anyway, don't get me going on this stuff. But anyway, the myostatin, basically, so when you work out, exercise that lowers at 45%. Okay. They also show that there was one study, it was an in vitro study. In other words, it involved isolated muscle cells. And in this study, it was published in 2010. It showed that 3 nutrients actually fairly effectively lowered myostatin. What are the nutrients? The nutrients are, one of them is called HMB. And HMB is a metabolite of the branched chain amino acid leucine. It's sold commercially, and it's got a very bad reputation because of all the hype that's been attached to it. Years ago, one guy wrote in his magazine that, he says, he talked about how HMB works like DECA. And of course, a bunch of bodybuilders, a bunch of people ran out and bought this HMB, and they didn't get any results like using decadurabolin, which is an anabolic steroid. So basically, it's got a bad reputation. A couple of studies over the years have shown that it seems to work well in beginners, it seems to work well in older people, and it seems to work well in people that tend to be overtrained. I'm talking about HMB, but in normal training, past a year, in other words, if you're an advanced trainee, unfortunately, HMB tends not to do much at all, and it is expensive, but it apparently does have an inhibitory effect on myostatin, at least when exposed directly to muscle cells. How much of an effect it would have in the actual human body is another question. The other nutrient is leucine itself. Leucine itself is the parent compound of HMB. It's a branched chain amino acid. It is the key amino acid involved in muscle protein synthesis. This is the amino acid that kind of marshals all the other essential amino acids, gets them together, and it stimulates a protein called mammalian target of rapamycin, which starts the cascade, which results in muscle protein synthesis, which could translate into increased muscle hypertrophy or growth, right? The third nutrient in this study that they discovered that that blocks myostatin is creatine. Creatine, yes, creatine. I mean, what doesn't creatine do? I mean, it seems to do everything, for crying out loud, Anyway, creatine was the third, and there was an independent study done that showed where they just checked creatine alone, and that study also showed that creatine tends to inhibit myostatin, right? Okay, it turns out that another nutrient, vitamin D. Vitamin D indirectly lowers myostatin, because what vitamin D does remember I talked about follistatin, this natural protein produced in the body, mainly the liver, that kind of locks onto myostatin in the blood and it prevents it from working. Well, it turns out that vitamin D boosts follistatin. So a lot of studies have shown that vitamin D seems to be involved in muscle growth. And this could be the reason, because it kind of boosts natural levels of follistatin. And you don't have to spend $100 a month on a useless egg yolk supplement, to isolated follistatin ripoff supplement. Anyway, now let's get to the actual existing, if you want to call it, drug forms of myostatin. But these are the things that exist now. They really do work, but they're all experimental and they're not available. So, please don't write to me and ask me where you can get this stuff. I can't get it myself. First of all, I wouldn't take a myostatin block for the reasons I said earlier. I am not seeking heart failure. So, all right, so I'll never be Mr. Olympia. Who cares? I'd rather live a long time, but that's me. You have to live your own life. But anyway, the first one we'll talk about is what they call anti-myostatin antibodies. And these are special antibodies that neutralize myostatin. Now, again, it's an injection form. Most of these things, I got to tell you, they're not oral. Because when you take something oral, if it's any kind of protein, it's going to be broken down by the acid and the enzymes in the gut. So most of these things, I got to warn you, are all They're all injections, most of them. They are all of them, actually. Anyway, the injection of this anti-myostatin antibody, it led to a 30% boost in muscle size in mice, along with a 10% increase in grip strength, which is kind of weird, because blocking myostatin doesn't increase strength, but it did in this study. The anti-myostatin antibodies did 10% increase in grip strength. One such antibody was called Myo 029. It was being investigated by a major drug company, but for some strange reason, which I don't really know the reason why, they abandoned the research. They just dropped it. I don't know whether it's because maybe they found this heart defect in the animal experiments. I don't know the details of why they decided to abandon after they spent God knows how much millions to develop this stuff. They just shelved it. But it really worked. It really, really blocked myostatin. There's another one that's really super effective myostatin blocker. Now, to explain how this thing works, you have to understand, without going into a lot of technical detail, when myostatin gets in the body, when it's produced, it locks on to a certain type of receptor in cells. They're called activin, A-C-T-I-V-I-N, activin type 2 receptors, right? Well, it turns out you can isolate these activin type 2 receptors, and you can make them soluble, and you can inject it into the body. When you inject the soluble activin type 2 receptor, it will lock on to myostatin, because myostatin is attracted to it. It will lock on to myostatin, and the myostatin is inactivated. It doesn't do anything. It's gone. It doesn't work. In fact, studies show that if you inject the soluble form of this soluble activite, the myostatin will be inactivated, and when they give it to animals, it produces a 60% increase in muscle size after 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Imagine that in a bodybuilder. And if you're a bodybuilder listening to this, think of what you'd look like. 60% muscle growth, 60% more muscle than you have now in 2 weeks. Think about that for a second, right? Okay. And of course, again, this requires an injection. It's not anything you could take orally. Then they have something called myostatin propeptides. Mice injected with a synthetic modified propeptide showed a 20% increase in muscle size after a month with no side effects. But that was only a month. It wasn't long term, so in other words, they couldn't check and see whether there'd be any heart problems or anything like that, So this was a short-term study, it also suppressed fat accumulation. In other words, the mice that took this myostatin propeptides, they were able to basically, oh, I love this. They were able to eat whatever they wanted, and there was just no fat accumulated. It was like the fat was gone. I suspect, this is again speculation on my part, I suspect that this stuff acutely stimulated brown adipose tissue, because mice, by the way, are much more responsive to brown adipose tissue than humans. If you could stimulate bat in mice, if you could turn mice into bats, if you pardon the expression, kind of, bats kind of look like mice anyway. But anyway, that's another story. But anyway, the thing is, if you could stimulate bat mice, you get this like dramatic like loss of fat, and they just don't get fat. They just don't get fat. And that's what happened in this study. And the myostatin propeptides, as far as stimulating muscle growth, the muscle growth increased 45 to 115%, depending on which muscle was examined. It varied with them. Some muscles got bigger than others. In other words, on the myostatin propeptides. Again, an injectable, no oral. There's no oral. Right? Keep that in mind. I know I keep saying that over and over again. And the reason I'm saying is because they're going to keep trying to lay these myostatin blocking supplements on you. I have no doubt they're going to continue. And don't waste your money. They're junk. They don't work. They're overly expensive. They're absolute garbage. All these things that really do block myostatin, they all are injectable. Cement that in your mind, burn it in your brain. Anyway, the next one is called truncated myostatin protein. Now, this is a type of myostatin protein that's been kind of altered, and it involves, subcutaneous injections. And what this stuff does is it boosts the number of satellite cells. Now, I should explain, I didn't say this earlier, but the main reason why myostatin actually blocks muscle growth is because it inhibits the differentiation and, let's say, usage of satellite cells. What are satellite cells? Satellite cells are muscle stem cells that are involved in the repair and growth of muscle. Every time you injure a muscle, even when you work out, you activate these satellite cells. The satellite cells go in and contribute what they call myonuclear domains. In other words, they allow you to basically increase, it's a little complicated, they allow you to increase muscle size. They're used for repair. But when you take, what myostatin does is it kind of blocks the activity of satellite cells. It also blocks something called the AKT pathway. That's a secondary way it also blocks muscle size. And that AKT pathway is involved in muscle protein synthesis. So myostatin blocks muscle growth by at least two known pathways. And it also works in concert with cortisone, which is a catabolic steroid. So myostatin stimulates cortisone, and together they basically destroy your muscles, right? Okay, so you have the truncated myostatin. So again, the truncated myostatin protein, again, you take it, it kicks out your satellite cells, you wind up growing, okay? And I mentioned follistatin earlier. Again, the injected follistatin, it attaches to the myostatin, inactivates it. When they give it to the mice, it does cause dramatic muscle growth. And as I said, the oral form, that's being sold now, the follistatin supplements, junk, don't use it. Now, here's the entry. This is, to me, the most interesting usage of myostatin blockage, if you want to call it. In the future, all the stuff like steroids and growth hormone, all that stuff's going to be passé. The future sports doping, I hate to use that expression doping, but that's what they call it. It's going to consist of what they call gene therapy, right? And it turns out that there's ways of actually inserting a myostatin blocking substances directly into the muscle. And now what this will do, of course, it will turn off the myostatin genes locally in the muscle, right? Which means that muscle will grow tremendously, but because it's localized to the muscle, it's not going to affect your heart. So you avoid that heart side effect. You probably also avoid the tendon side effect. So this is a way of harnessing the power of myostatin without the side effects. And when they figure out a way to do this safely, I think that you're going to suddenly see some very muscular athletes going on. But whether it will actually ever be used, I couldn't say. That's, again, speculation. Now, I have to tell you that all these things that I just discussed, these kind of new therapies for blocking or inhibiting myostatin, They're not being developed for bodybuilders. They're not being developed for athletes. What they're being developed for are muscle diseases, like, for example, muscular dystrophy, which is, of course, associated with a marked weakening of muscles, because these people are born without a gene for a certain protein that's needed to maintain muscles. And animal experiments show that if you give them some of these experimental myostatin blockers, it seems to actually greatly help treat muscular dystrophy, right? But again, that's in the early stages. It's not a useful therapy at this point. It's still experimental. The other possible use for myostatin would be to treat what they call sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is a loss of muscle or loss of lean mass with age. And again, it would take a whole video to explain all the nuances behind sarcopenia, but myostatin might be very useful because if you block the loss of muscle, some of these people with sarcopenia are so weak they can't even work out. But if you somehow are able to block myostatin in these people, you're going to completely stop the loss of muscle. So it could be a useful therapy for that too. And also, myostatin might be useful in the treatment of obesity for the reasons I said earlier. Again, if you're able to temper the work of myostatin in the body, you will tend to not only stimulate this beige fat that I mentioned, the special thermogenic fat, but you also seem to be able to control obesity. So it can be used in obesity, and as a corollary to that, it can also be used in the future to treat and possibly prevent diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which is related to fat and fat cells and that kind of stuff. So, it could, again, myostatin could be used in the future to treat diabetes and also prevent obesity. So that's about it for myostatin. I think you can see right now it's kind of a crapshoot. I'll just sum up by saying that, and from what I could see from my research, the only possible really beneficial way to employ myostatin, a myostatin blocker or inhibitor, whatever you want to call it, would be through the gene therapy route, because any of these injectable forms, they're systemic, and there's a danger of getting that brittle tendon effect and also the heart effects, and the lack of endurance, all that kind of stuff is not going to be really great for your workout. So, I mean, even if it made your muscles grow, the negative effects kind of outweigh, I would say, in my mind, outweigh the benefits. I just want to talk a little about my newsletter, which is it's called Applied Metabolics. It's at appliedmetabolics.com. The next issue, which is the September issue, marks the 1-year anniversary of this newsletter. I came out with the newsletter because I wrote for magazines for about 35 years, and I was really tired of seeing all the degeneration of the magazines. The articles were terrible. They had very bad misinformation in them. The web was offering just garbage. Websites, blogs. I saw a blog the other day, for example. It was telling people to take 900 milligrams of melatonin per kilogram of body weight. Right? Now, your body produces melatonin in microgram amounts. That's 1,000th of a gram. 1,000 micrograms of 1,000 micrograms equal 1 milligram. This site was telling people to take 900 milligrams of melatonin per kilogram. That would probably kill you. So, this guy, it was calling itself a science site. And, this is the kind of thing that makes me write my newsletter, to kind of counter that nonsense and that crap. Everything you read in my newsletter is evidence-based, and it's all true. For example, the next issue, my lead article is something that I wanted to write for the last 20 years, but I couldn't get it published in any bodybuilding magazine for obvious reasons. And what that is the placebo effect. Placebo is basically a substance that is inert, yet produces actual results or effects based on your own belief in the substance. In other words, if you believe something's going to work in 40% to 60% of the time, it will. Now, the gist of my article on placebo, I'm going to explain how this fits in with your workouts and, in particular, your supplements. I'm going to tell you in detail, and this is why this article was never published in a bodybuilding magazine. I'm going to tell you in detail exactly how the supplement industry hoodwinks you into continually buying supplements that are probably doing absolutely nothing, but you think they're doing something, right? I'm going to tell you how it works. I'm going to even go into the parts of the brain that are involved in the placebo effect, okay? Then I'm going to talk, I have another article on coconut oil, which is a pretty popular subject. Coconut oil, it's has all kinds of health effects associated with it. I got the idea to write this article because I saw a couple of not blog sites, ads, where they were touting how they were saying that coconut oil might possibly either cure or prevent Alzheimer's disease, which is on the rise. Alzheimer's disease is going to be a terrible, terrible thing for the baby boomers and the people that are my age or getting older. It's going to be a horrible health crisis coming up if something isn't done. And I talk about the possibility. I did some research into it. I talk about whether or not coconut oil can actually help prevent Alzheimer's disease, and also its other use in working out and body fat loss and all that stuff. So this is basically a definitive article on coconut oil. When you read this article, you'll know everything there is to know about coconut oil. Then I have an article on a possibly new potential additive in protein supplements, which are of course very popular with people that work out. I'm going to talk about some of the deceptive tactics that the supplement industry is using in their protein supplements, and then I'm going to talk about this particular substance, which is already showing up in some protein supplements. This is a whole new level, because this stuff is very, very dangerous. This stuff is potentially toxic. It can cause serious illness, and I think it needs to be exposed. Nobody's exposing it. Nobody's talking about it. I'm talking about it. It's going to be in my newsletter, and then in the September issue. And then I have another article on a study that is just about to come out. It's going to be published September 1st in the journal Cell Metabolism, and it's a study that compared a low-fat diet to a low-carb diet. And this study is, there's been articles all over the web about it. It's very highly controversial, because what this study found is that consuming, this is a human study, by the way, not animals. This human study found that consuming a low-fat diet produced a more fat loss than a low-carb diet. Now, what my article does is I'm going to look at this study, I'm going to tell you about it, and I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to tell you whether or not this study is accurate. I mean, should we all really abandon low carbs and go back to low fat? I mean, is that the way to go? Was Pritikin and all those low fat advocates, were they right when Dr. Atkins was wrong? I mean, also this another point of the study was to see whether insulin. I mean, a key point of low carb diets is to control insulin, because the theory is that insulin makes you fat. I'm going to discuss that, whether or not insulin actually makes you fat. In fact, that was one of the main points of this study, was to see whether insulin is involved in stimulating body fat. I'm going to explain all of that in this article, okay? And future in future issues of Applied Metabolics, I'm going to have features about, for example, the microbiome. What's the microbiome? The microbiome is your resident intestinal bacteria. It's exploding research. It's the hottest thing in medicine right now. They're discovering all kinds of things. I mean, it's this bacteria that resides in a body. They're involved in everything. I mean, involved in brain function. They're involved in body composition. They're involved in energy production. They're involved in disease prevention. It turns out that a lot of things that people do are destroying their microbiome. They're creating possible chronic illnesses. A lot of the reason people feel sick is because of what they're eating and their habits, how they're adversely affecting the microbiome. I'm going to explain this in my article, and I'm going to explain how to keep a healthy microbiome. It's not very hard to do. It just requires a couple of minor changes, and that's what that article is going to entail. So that's going to be in there. I'm also going to have an article on citrulline, which is an amino acid that really does stimulate nitric oxide. And a lesser known effect is that it's involved in muscle protein synthesis. I'm going to explain all the nuances about that particular amino acid that have not been explained in other articles. I've talked about beets before in prior videos, how beets affect the increase in nitric oxide, but I'm going to go into much greater detail in a full article in my Applied Metabolic newsletter, and I'm going to tell you other little tricks that I haven't talked about related to beets and nitric oxide in that article. And then I'm going to take on another controversial subject. These are all future articles, by the way. I'm going to take on a subject, vegetarianism. I mean, there's a big controversy. Over and over again, you see these articles that you can't build muscle if you're a vegan or a straight vegetarian. A vegan, of course, only eats fruits and vegetables. There are different levels of vegetarianism. There's lacto-ovo, we eat milk and eggs, so on and so forth. My article is going to talk about, the possibility of whether or not you can actually build muscle as a vegetarian, as either a vegan or a lacto-ovo, meaning somebody who drinks milk and eggs. I'm going to talk about how to get the most benefit if you do opt to go a vegetarian route, how to do it healthfully, where you don't lose any muscle size, you don't get any weak, you get in great shape, and you can still make gains. This has never been done before. Nobody's ever discussed this. All the other articles have been very negative, how it lowers your testosterone, all this stuff. I'm going to tell you the truth about it, which has never been published to my knowledge anywhere else. I'm also going to discuss new research about vitamin C that has, again, not appeared on the web. It's in very, very esoteric medical journals that are read by about 10 geeks in Indianapolis. Nobody else looks at these journals. So I'm going to tell you a lot of things about vitamin C that you probably don't know. I'm going to also talk about, is there an advantage to natural vitamin C over synthetic vitamin C? Okay. And I have another article on what slows the aging process now, not the future, now. What can you do now that will slow down the rate of aging? Again, nobody has really talked about this in detail. I will, I'm going to talk about, you've probably heard the expression roid rage, how when some people take anabolic steroids, they kind of like freak out, they get crazy. What they really don't often discuss is how anabolic steroids actually affect your brain. What happens in the brain itself when you take anabolic steroids? Does it cause some changes that could kind of like make you prone to this so-called roid rage, or is it just a bunch of nonsense? I'm going to talk about it in that article, right? I've done an article already in my Applied Metabolics newsletter about the nuances and controversies related to low carbohydrate dieting. So now I'm going to go on the flip side. I'm going to have an article on the benefits of carbohydrates as an ergogenic aid. In other words, how to use carbohydrates most effectively to gain muscle size and increase energy and athletic performance. A couple of people have asked me to do this, and I'm gonna do it. It's going to be a fantastic article. There's going to be things in there that I think are going to really surprise you that you had no idea are related to carbohydrates, right? I mean, it's much more extensive than you believe. I have another article on how dieting, strangely and paradoxically enough, can actually make you fatter. If you diet in certain ways, you will actually get fatter. And I'll explain that. And certain people are more prone to this than others. I'll explain how. I'm also going to discuss another controversy, which is there's a lot of people that are walking around. They're called the metabolically fit but fat phenotype is what the scientists call it. Meaning, these are people that have, let's say, they're not super obese, but they have a higher levels of body fat. But in all other ways, they're normal. They have like normal cholesterol levels, normal blood glucose levels. The controversy is this really healthy, or in the long run, will having excess fat eventually, and this is what some people say, will eventually cause health problems no matter how much exercise you do. So I'm going to really clarify that in this article, whether you can be both fat and fit at the same time. I have another article on another popular subject, intermittent fasting. That's basically where you do short-term fasts. I'm going to explain the possible health benefits, some of the negative effects, and I'm also going to explain how to do it for best results where you don't sacrifice any muscle, but can get some of the, let's say, body fat loss benefits. I'm going to also talk about how it might affect longevity in that particular article. I'm going to also talk about how testosterone affects women. They just came out with a drug. They're calling it the female Viagra. Viagra. It is not a testosterone drug. They tried to get testosterone drugs for females on the market as a means of stimulating sex drive, because testosterone is the hormone that stimulates the libido in both sexes, but they can never approve it because of the idea that taking any kind of testosterone is very dangerous for women and is in any level of testosterone, and it's going to cause all kinds of health problems. Well, in my article, I'm going to tell you the truth about it. I'm going to tell you how testosterone can be beneficial for women. So that's another article, Women and Testosterone. I am going to talk about, in a separate article, how to boost brown. I briefly talked about brown adipose tissue in this video. I'm going to have a complete article on how to boost brown fat without taking any drugs, totally natural. There's a way to do it, and I'm going to talk about that in the future. By the way, the future drugs to treat obesity probably will involve a thermogenic activity, meaning that they'll probably find a way to synthetically stimulate brown fat, and that might be the eventual actual cure for obesity up the line, because the current drugs for obesity stink out loud, to put it in a phrase that none of them really work. They're all appetite suppressants. One or two of them are antidepressants. They're garbage. And one of them as I talked about in one of my articles in Applied Metabolics, it blocks fat absorption and it makes you, where if you laugh, you wind up crapping your pants. I mean, you don't want to deal with these kind of fat loss drugs. Anyway, so there's a lot of other topics I'll be discussing in my Applied Metabolics. I'm going to have articles. I have my half a century of experience. Besides the hard science I include in there, I make it easy to read for anyone. I read it on a 6th grade level. You don't have to have a science degree to read it. It doesn't read like a medical journal. It reads like a magazine article, because that's what I've written for 35 years. And I guarantee you will learn from my newsletter. I'm including in my newsletter, I always include my empirical experience. In other words, everything I've learned in the past 50 years, I'm gonna pass on to you in this newsletter. I'm not gonna write it anywhere else. I have not written this stuff in any magazine articles I've written. So that's that. Again, it's www.appliedmetabolics.com. And I also would request that those of you who watch this video, very often when I put, in past videos, people have contacted me through my newsletter site to ask me questions. I hate to be like, I don't want to be nasty about this, but I have very limited time, and I prefer to keep my questions, answer questions limited to those who subscribe to my newsletter. If you want to do a separate consult with me, I can arrange that. But honestly, I cannot answer unsolicited questions. I just don't have the time. A lot of times, a lot of these questions are complicated. They require time on my part. It's not fair to me. You wouldn't do that if you went to your doctor or lawyer. You have to pay a fee. I'm not asking you for a fee. I'm just telling you that I have to keep the questions. So please don't send me unsolicited questions if you're not a subscriber to my newsletter. Thank you for listening. Have a great day, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.